Chapter 9 The Shameful Scheme. The next night we laid up under a little willow growing out in the middle of the river. There were villages along both banks, and the Duke and the King began to lay out plans for work in all of them. They wanted to try the Nonesuch tragedy again because there was so much money in it, but they figured it wouldn't be safe because the news might have spread by now. Since they couldn't agree on a project, the Duke said he would rest for a day and work his brains for a while. The King decided to drop over to another village without any plan and just trust in Providence to lead him from the profitable way. We had all bought store clothes at our last stop. The King put on his and made quite a fuss over them. The King's duds were all black, and he looked mighty fine and starchy in 'em. But when he had on that white beaver coat, he looked so grand and good, no one would ever suspect that he was just a low-down crook. Jim cleaned up the canoe, and so the King wouldn't get dirty, and I got my paddle ready. Then we saw a big steamboat laying at the shore about 3 miles above the town. Since the King was so well dressed, he decided it would look better if we arrived at the town on the steamboat rather than in the canoe. So he had me paddle him up the river to meet the steamboat. I didn't have to be convinced to take a steamboat ride. That was a treat for anyone living along the Mississippi. As we paddled up the river close to shore, I spotted a young, innocent-looking country boy sitting on a log and swabbing the sweat off his face. A couple of big carpetbags sat on the riverbank beside him. The King had me steer the canoe towards the boy. "Where are you bound for?" the King called, as we came close to the bank. "I'm waiting for the steamboat to New Orleans," replied the boy. The King gave him a big smile and invited him into the canoe. Since we were heading for the steamboat, we could take him there too. The young chap thanked the King, then added, "When I first saw you, I said to myself, it's Mr. Wilks for sure. He came mighty close to getting here on time. You aren't him, are you?" "No, I'm Reverend Alexander Blodgett," lied the King. "But tell me, lad, why did Mr. Wilks have to get here on time?" The King was becoming curious about this Mr. Wilks, and he began to pump the boy for all the information he could get. The boy was only too happy to tell all he knew. He seen that Mr. Wilks was due to arrive from England. His brother Peter had lived in this little town till his death 2 days ago. Peter hadn't seen his brothers, Harvey and William, since they were children in England. Peter had come to this country years ago with his brother George, who died some time ago, but his other two brothers still lived in England. Harvey was a preacher, and the poor, unfortunate younger brother, William, was deaf and dumb. The boy went on and on with the story. It seemed pretty boring to me, but the King was fascinated. You see, Peter Wilks had left behind a great deal of money. When he knew he was dying, he had written a letter to his brother Harvey in England, telling him just where the money was hidden and giving him the rights to it. Peter's wife had died years ago, and he had no children. All he had in the whole world were his three nieces, George's daughters, and his two brothers over in England. At this point, I could see the King's mind working up a sweat. He asked the boy all sorts of questions. How old were the three nieces? What did they look like? What were their names? He inquired about everybody and everything in that blessed town. When he had finished questioning the boy, we dropped him off at the steamboat. The King never said anything about going on board, so I lost my ride after all. When the boat was gone, the King made me paddle up another mile to a deserted place on the riverbank. Then he and the Duke went ashore. As he left, the King said to me, "Now hustle back and bring me the new carpetbags up here. And hurry." I knew what he was up to all right, but I never said a word. I did just what he told me. When I got back with the bags, the King and Duke were sitting on a log talking about what the young boy had told them. All the while the King was talking, he tried to look and talk like an Englishman. He did it pretty well, too. Then he asked the Duke if he could pretend he was deaf and dumb. The Duke said he was a master at that, so then they waited for the next steamboat. About the middle of the afternoon, a big boat came up to the river. They hailed it, and we went aboard. We only had to go about 5 miles. This made the captain pretty angry, what with having to stop and all, but the King gave him a few extra dollars to soothe his temper. When the people in the village saw the big steamboat, they flocked to the shore. The first thing the King did when he got on the land was to walk up to a group of men and ask, "Excuse me, can any of you gentlemen tell me where Mr. Peter Wilks lives?" The men glanced at one another and nodded their heads as if to say, "What did I tell you?" Then one of them said real gently, "Poor Mr. Wilks has just passed away." Before I could turn around, the King went all to pieces. He fell against one of the men, put his head on the man's shoulder, and cried down his back. Then he turned around, blubbering, and made a lot of idiotic signs with his hands to the Duke. The Duke immediately fell on one of the men and burst out crying too. They weren't the meanest lot that I ever saw.